Okay, so today I have with me Beth Randall, who is the fourth in our Humanities speaker series that we've held this summer and fall. And she is talking on the topic of occupational therapy. So earlier this month, we did host this talk in person at the Trudeau Sanatorium in the auditorium building on that campus. And we also took a sneak peek at the Schofield workshop where patients actually took part in occupational therapy. And now we're recording the talk so that those who were unable to attend in person can still appreciate the subject matter and all of Beth's knowledge. So Beth is a certified occupational therapist who holds her doctorate in occupational therapy. She is a clinical assistant professor in the occupational therapy department at Clarkson University and also directs the Assistive Technology Resource and Education Center housed in the Clarkson OT department. She has 2 decades of experience working in various pediatric settings, as well as addressing assistive technology needs for students and adults. Beth prioritizes a client-centered vision of occupational therapy based on the belief that people achieve well-being through engagement and activities they find meaningful. In her courses, Beth emphasizes the importance of recognizing individuals' values as well as their wider social and physical contexts and how these impact engagement and well-being. So we are so excited to share this topic again with everyone today. And I'm going to stop my video, mute myself, and hand it over to Beth to share her presentation.
All right, thank you, Mahela. I'm glad to be sharing this information, hopefully with a wider audience. So it's exciting that we get to record this and make this information available to a wider group. So I'd like to start off by again thanking Historic Saranac Lake, not only for inviting me to speak, but giving me the opportunity to explore the archives and all the amazing information the group is preserving in the history of occupational therapy in Saranac Lake. So as Mahela said, I've been an OT since 2000, primarily working in pediatrics, infants to young adults in their schools and in their home settings as well. Since 2019, I've been a full-time professor at Clarkson in our Master of Science in Occupational Therapy program. And I also provide assistive technology training and evaluation services to adults who are seeking to pursue higher education or employment. And we also oversee the AT Resource Center, which provides information on assistive technology and loans of devices to residents of the North Country. So I'm going to talk a little bit today about just the field of occupational therapy and our roots, both in Saranac Lake and in a much wider context, and discuss how that history continues to inform the way we practice occupational therapy today. So when speaking about OT, there are 2 quotes from famous OTs that I really love, and I plan to start with one and end with one today. The first quote is from Mary Riley, who was a leader in the field of occupational therapy in the 1960s to the 1980s. And her most famous statement about OT is a great place to start today. So she stated in 1960, had a little bit of screen sharing problem there. In 1962, that man, through the use of his hands, as they are energized by mind and will, can influence the state of his own health. I really believe that's a powerful statement, that by engaging in the tasks that we want to engage in and desire to engage in, we can impact our own health, both physical health and mental health. That statement really, to me, gets to the heart of what occupational therapy is. The American Occupational Therapy Association just last year in 2020 defined the practice of OT as, quote, achieving health, well-being, and participation in life through engagement in occupation, end quote. The philosophy of OT really is based on the idea that our physical and mental health and well-being are impacted by our ability to engage in our individually meaningful occupations. So before I can tell you more about occupational therapy, a profession that's only officially about 110 years old, but goes back much further, I'd like to start by putting us on common ground. Most individuals, when they hear the word occupation, think of work. For years, we've been thinking of, we look at occupational assessments. What are you going to do for a job or for work? And so we may think of occupations as the paid or unpaid things we do to support ourselves or perhaps give back to our families or communities, like volunteer work. The roots of OT have a strong connection to this concept, and I'll talk a little more about that shortly. But today, OTs really think of occupations as much wider than work. Your occupations are the things that you do that are meaningful to you. That may be work, but it may also be your play or leisure activities. It might be your social relationships with others. It could be the things you do to care for yourself, like eating or grooming tasks. It might be the things you do to care for those around you, like cooking meals, taking care of your family pet, or going grocery shopping. Your occupations could be the things you do daily, like getting a shower. They could be weekly, like laundry, or they might be very occasional. For example, if your family always spends Christmas Eve watching a favorite Christmas movie and baking cookies, that's a meaningful occupation, even if it only occurs once a year. You might also define your occupations by the roles that you find meaningful in life. For example, if I were to define my valued occupations, I often talk about being a wife, a mom, a sister, a daughter, a teacher, a skier, a crafter, a kayaker, and of course, being an OT. Those roles define the occupations that are meaningful to me. So I encourage you, as you're listening to this talk, to think about the occupations you find meaningful and think about how what you do defines who you are to yourself. Consider that when you aren't feeling well and you can't do your normal activities, think about how that impacts your overall well-being, including your mental health. Often, if we're not feeling physically well, we may not feel mentally well or emotionally well either. And finally, think about if illness or injury removed your ability to complete the tasks you engage in, which activities would you miss the most? Which ones would you most desire to have back in either their original or a modified form? So, with that in mind, I want to tell you a little bit about how the field of occupational therapy came to exist in the early 20th century. While part of my original education in occupational therapy included the history of OT, I truly had no idea about how much early occupational therapy was occurring here in the Adirondacks until November of 2019, when Amy visited Clarkson and I first learned about early OT in Saranac Lake. Then we had the good fortune to be able to bring some of our OT students down to historic Saranac Lake in early 2020 to view the museum and learn more about OT in Saranac Lake. And more recently, I've had a chance to spend time in the archives. And I'm deeply grateful again to the group for preserving these archives, which are really kind of a treasure trove of OT history right in my backyard. So if we think about the roots of using occupation as a means to promote and restore health, we can look all the way back to first century Greece, where Galen, who was a Greek physician who wrote extensively about the medical arts at that time, wrote of employment as nature's best physician. He also stated that it was essential to human happiness. So those roots of doing and being involved in meaningful occupation go back that far as being important to human health. Unfortunately, over the ensuing centuries, our limited scientific and medical knowledge meant that many people did not survive the illnesses or disabilities that impacted their ability to engage with their desired or required occupations. In particular, those with mental illnesses were often confined to asylums, where treatments were, at best, non-existent, but at worst, often cruel or inhumane. Asylums also offered little in the way of activity or engagement at that time. But in the late 19th century, several social movements converged that gave rise to the consideration of meaningful engagement in occupation. The settlement house movement, which was really started in Chicago and New York City, created facilities to help newly arrived immigrants to learn English, find housing, and develop work skills. So Jane Addams, who was a big leader in the settlement house movement, and her colleagues realized that work skills were essential to the success of immigrants settling into their new country and their new environment. At the same time, in both Britain and the United States, the arts and crafts movement was rising. And the arts and crafts movement was kind of a reaction to increased industrialization. And this movement promoted the value of handcraft over mass or industrially produced objects. They valued a return to the creation of items by hand, and even kind of emphasized a higher moral value to those items which were handmade over those produced by an industrial society. Thirdly, the late 19th century also saw the rise of moral treatment of individuals with mental illness. Many of the early founders of occupational therapy worked with individuals who had mental illnesses, and they engaged patients in what some of them called the work cure. And this involved teaching them crafts such as knitting, crocheting, weaving, and rug making. And these psychologists and social workers and physicians, who would become known as the founders of occupational therapy, first theorized and then witnessed that engaging individuals with mental illness in goal-directed, meaningful activity improved their overall health and their overall functioning. The Adirondack Cottage Sanatorium was an early adopter of the idea of providing meaningful activity to promote improvement in those individuals who had come to Saranac Lake to recover from tuberculosis. While rest and fresh air were considered essential to recovery, those individuals who were able to were also prescribed exercise in the form of walking generally. In 1903, Dr. Trudeau proposed to the board that the sanatorium should provide occupational training to patients in order that they should learn, quote, branches of practical handiwork, end quote, and to be able to support themselves. So they were thinking about the idea of patients who might recover well enough to return to working, but not to return to possibly very physically demanding jobs. Under Dr. Trudeau and Dr. Brown, who was a resident physician at the time, the staff converted a cure cottage into the first patient's workshop in 1904. And I believe that's the one that's pictured here. So Herbert Schofield, who was a teacher who had come to Saranac Lake in 1902 as a TB patient, was kind of enlisted as the first teacher and director of the workshop. He first taught 4 skills. He taught bookbinding, illumination, photography, and framing. Illumination is that piece that I showed on my first slide with that beautiful illustration and vivid coloring of that book page. These 4 skills were considered to be potentially marketable and profitable for the students to learn, as well as fairly accessible and learnable by most individuals. Illumination, as I said, that was on my opening slide, was reportedly most successful early on, as these items were popular to be sold by patients. And at this initial time, patients were permitted to spend time in the workshop at about twice their allotted exercise time each day. So if they were allowed 30 minutes of exercise a day, they would be allowed to spend up to an hour in the workshop learning skills. So I think this is just a really great picture. It feels so very Adirondack to me, that they are sitting on the porch of what appears to be almost a platform tent, working on bookbinding. And you can see that the gentleman who's kind of sitting on the railing there is Herbert Schofield, who was the first director of the workshop. There's a quote from the occupational therapy scrapbook in the archives from around 1906 that I think really paints a wonderful picture of the value of meaningful occupation that these people were seeing in the workshop. Quote, "The workshop is not primarily a place to make money or produce things of value. Its great usefulness lies in affording the patients pleasant occupation to relieve the monotony of institutional life. Complaints about nothing to do have completely ceased, and many patients have found an interesting and an absorbing occupation. And others, while reaping this advantage, have been able to earn part of their expenses." End quote. So clearly, the doctors and the staff were seeing that individuals who were there as patients found engaging in meaningful activity, being able to do something that was goal-directed, really helped improve at least their mental health and their engagement, since they stopped complaining about having nothing to do. So the program was popular enough that a donor, Mrs. Walter Goodwin, who unfortunately her own first name seems to be lost to time. I was only able to find her husband's name, but Mrs. Walter Goodwin contributed money to build the dedicated OT workshop building, which was later named the Schofield Memorial Workshop. It was built in 1909. And as you can see, it still stands and right now is undergoing renovation, which is very exciting. So it's great to see that building still there and being ready to be used again. So that building was built in 1909. And by 1910, the physicians at the sanatorium were including workshop time specifically in their orders for patients. So now it wasn't just, you can also go to the workshop in addition to exercise, but they were prescribing workshop time. And by 1920, the occupations or the activities that they were offering had expanded to include telegraphy, stenography, leather work, copper and brass work, wood carving, typewriting, sewing. There's a great picture in the archives that unfortunately I don't have here of them making wooden sleds for kids in the winter. In 1912, they reported that they had tried basket making and lace making with little success, although basket making will come back a little bit later here. By 1920, they were doing, they had installed a pottery kiln and they were doing jewelry crafting. From my own perspective as an OT, it was really fun to realize how many of the activities that these patients were doing in the 1910s and by 1920 in the workshop are some of the tasks I was still learning in OT school in the mid-1990s, including leather work, copper work, and woodworking. So in the meantime, the idea of occupational therapy was catching on well beyond Saranac Lake in the treatment of those with mental illness, tuberculosis, and as practiced by individuals known as reconstruction aides who worked with World War I soldiers who were recovering from both their physical and their psychological wounds of war. These reconstruction aides taught academic subjects, vocational skills, and a variety of handcrafts similar to those taught in the workshop at Saranac Lake. I share this picture because I think it is great fun to see this young reconstruction aide visiting a soldier in his bed in France in World War I. And it's kind of hard to tell, but she's brought him knitting. which seems now maybe like a really interesting choice for a young male soldier recovering from war, but knitting has become trendy again, so perhaps it was a good choice. In 1917, 6 individuals had met in Clifton Springs, New York, to form the National Society for Promotion of Occupational Therapy. And while I'm not aware of any of them having ties directly to the program in Saranac Lake, one of those 6 founders, George Edward Barton, had been diagnosed with tuberculosis in 1901 and had moved to Denver, Colorado to take the fresh air cure there. He eventually recovered enough to return to New York State and settled in Clifton Springs, New York, where he founded his own small private sanatorium known as Consolation House. And that's where this initial founding of the Society for the Promotion of Occupational Therapy happened. As OTs, we often speak of the roots of OT being in the treatment of mental health, but indeed the use of meaningful activity to treat patients with tuberculosis was represented at that meeting through Dr. Barton. In that same year, 1917, the Adirondack Cottage Sanatorium reported that they had begun offering the instructional services of the workshop to patients residing in other sanatoria and homes in the area, in town, as well as sending instructors to the bedsides of patients who were unable to get to the workshop. I gather that actually basket weaving was one of the activities they often brought to people's bedsides because it was fairly portable and achievable while sitting in bed. In 1921, Herbert Schofield died after 17 years directing what had become a really robust and wide-ranging program at the sanatorium. The workshop would be renamed in his honor in 1924, I believe at the request of the original donor. And the program went on not only to teach meaningful occupations in the form of handcrafts, but also taught many patients who went on to work in or run occupational therapy programs at other sanatoria. An excerpt from the scrapbook around 1930 reports, quote, "The subject of useful occupation during convalescence from tuberculosis takes on greater importance every year. The Potts Memorial Sanatorium at Livingston, New York, has been established for this purpose. And it is of interest to know that 15 of our patients have already been employed there after discharge from Trudeau." End quote. So Trudeau was really crucial in also spreading the word of this really important treatment idea to other sanatoria. Edith Evans, who worked at Trudeau till 1922, actually presented a paper on the organization of a curative workshop at the 12th annual meeting of the American Occupational Therapy Association in 1928, therefore contributing to national promotion of the benefits of OT in tuberculosis treatment. Those of you who have attended the exhibit or know the history of Saranac Lake know that many artists spent time here curing, and some of them discovered their art here, or their time in Saranac Lake changed how they engaged in their art. And we know that for those individuals, engaging in their art was undoubtedly a meaningful occupation. From the perspective of OT, I'd like to highlight a few of my favorite discoveries from this exhibit and from the archives that I think really speak to the power of occupational therapy to provide meaningful engagement and healing. First, certainly those of you who are familiar with the area will be familiar with Betty and Martin Coop, who met and married at Trudeau. They both learned metalworking and jewelry making techniques in the OT in the Schofield workshop. They went on to run the Temming Art Studio in Saranac Lake from the mid-1940s until the early 1970s. And it's my understanding that certainly many of their pieces are still around town and individuals have those. I think these are kind of fun pictures. I love this picture of Betty looking just young and fresh-faced, getting her mail one day. Donald Mott Chapin and Elise Chapin, Donald came to Saranac Lake to cure, and later actually taught for the Saranac Lake Craft Guild also. He and his wife ran a pottery shop called the Pot Shop in Saranac Lake. And my understanding is that he did the forming the dishes in the pots, and she was the decorator or the painter. Third, I unfortunately don't have a picture to go with this, but an individual named Sam Sensani came to Saranac Lake actually in the early 1950s, so much later, to cure at Will Rogers. He had owned a movie theater in Kansas, which was his connection to the entertainment industry. But after spending 2 periods curing at Will Rogers, he ended up taking the skills that he had learned and becoming a recreation therapist at a TB hospital in Chanute, Kansas. And there's a wonderful interview with his son talking about that experience in the historic Saranac Lake archives. This is one of my favorite pictures that I found going through the archives of an individual named Ed Worthington, who came to Saranac Lake to cure in 1934. Ed learned radio broadcasting, built his own radios, and made broadcasts from his cure bed. His broadcast logs are in the archives at Historic Saranac Lake and are really great fun to read through, particularly when he talks about, bad winter storms interfering with, being able to broadcast. Ed was also featured in an article in Red Book magazine in 1950. He went on to teach electronics and direct and teach in the X-ray technology program at the Saranac Lake Rehabilitation Guild. And that program went on to become the basis of the X-ray technology program that still exists at North Country Community College. The eventual Saranac Lake Rehabilitation Guild that was formed in the 1950s offered occupational therapy services to individuals in the area, and also helped train individuals to provide OT services during its short lifespan. So these stories and so many more, some that we know and some that are surely lost to time, illustrate the impact of occupation on health and well-being. These individuals all found work, and likely meaningful work, in the purposeful activities they learned in the occupational therapy workshop in Saranac Lake. As you all likely know, the advent of antibiotic treatment for tuberculosis eventually meant the end of the sanatoria. And around the same time, and moving into the 1970s, occupational therapy as a whole was also going through a significant culture shift, away from being perceived as crafts teachers to wishing to align to a more medical model of scientific treatment. While the profession retained a focus on the value of activity and occupation, OT also lost ground as mental health facilities closed with the community reintegration and deinstitutionalization movement, as tuberculosis became treatable with antibiotics, and as other medical advances changed the types of clients that occupational therapists worked with. Into this time, enter Mary Riley, who spoke in 1962 about the power of working with one's hands. Her Eleanor Clark Slagle lecture, which is a very illustrious lectureship in occupational therapy, that year proposed that occupational therapy had the potential to be one of the most powerful ideas of the 20th century if the profession maintained its central belief in meaningful occupational engagement. Mary Riley also argued for the power of occupational therapy to support individuals in their occupational roles, whether those be work, housework, studying, leisure activities, or other roles that people sought to engage in. You can hear echoes of Mary Riley when I describe my occupations by the roles I fulfill in life. So where does this leave occupational therapy today? I would argue that at over 100 years old, we're more relevant and the power of meaningful occupation is stronger than ever. OTs work in hospitals, in nursing homes, in schools, and in community-based settings. We're supporting individuals throughout the lifespan to engage in their meaningful occupations, including their play, their leisure, their self-care skills, work, health maintenance activities, social participation, and more. We don't do a lot of weaving or copper tooling in most settings today anymore, but we still might woodwork, sew, paper craft, scrapbook, indeed, whatever occupations our clients find meaningful, motivating, and engaging, we're helping them engage in. And this brings me to my second favorite quote about OT. Virginia Stoffel, who was the president of the American Occupational Therapy Association from 2013 to 2016, summed up OT in this way: that occupational therapy practitioners ask what matters to you, not what's the matter with you. As an OT, I've always strived, and I teach my students to strive to understand what their clients value and seek to achieve, because it's when we are seeking to do the things that mean the most to us that we are improving our own health and well-being more. The individuals who came to Saranac Lake and the other sanatoria at the time strove for health and recovery. And I'm proud to be a part of and to teach a profession that helped many individuals recover, not only through fresh air, but also through engaging in meaningful tasks and activities, whether they were ones they had done before or new ones they discovered during their recovery. It seems as though everything we talk about these days comes back to our current situation with the COVID pandemic. And I invite you to take a moment and consider the impact the global pandemic has had on your occupational engagement. Did your work or school move to being done at home, including many extra hours on the computer? Well, OTs were busy advising individuals on how to set up ergonomic workstations in their home and educating them on the importance of positioning and frequent screen breaks to prevent fatigue and injury. Did travel restrictions keep you from seeing your beloved family or friends far away? OTs, both locally and nationwide, were teaching nursing home residents how to use iPads and how to access FaceTime in order to be able to see their family members safely. There are so many examples of how OTs continue to impact individuals in their meaningful occupations. And I really hope that I've helped you understand a bit more about the healing power of occupation today and giving you some perspective on the role that occupational therapy played in Saranac Lake, as well as a variety of other settings. I want to just close by thanking Historic Saranac Lake again for hosting me, and would love to answer any questions.
Thank you, Beth. This was just as interesting the second time around. And now that I wasn't running tech from behind a projector, I was able to make some more connections myself as well. So I'm glad that we did a second recording. One of the things you said that struck me was when you said, you've talked a lot about it's not just about doing work or having a job. But just, the daily activities that, occupy your time. And you mentioned, when you're sick, what activities do you want back? And it made me think about historically, when we're looking at the occupational therapy at the Trudeau Sanatorium, we often kind of grasp onto the flashier activities, the craft activities and the things that were done in the workshop. But we forget about how many patients were just so excited to be allowed to go for a walk, like how important that was to them. And, the first time you were healthy enough to get out of bed and go to the dining hall at the sanatorium, all the other patients would cheer for you and clap for you. So it made me think of that, and that, even though that technically then they weren't thinking of that as occupational therapy, but those little steps were part of that as well.
Absolutely. Well, consider too, just being able to go to the dining room, the social engagement piece of being able to sit and dine with,
Mm,
a group of people, not be sitting eating in your bed. It's
yes,
powerful. We don't think about it until it's gone, but it's really
exactly.
powerful.
And patients were in the handbook for patients at the sanatorium. They were told you should not talk about your illness at the dining table. You should talk about something else. And I think they did that for two reasons, as far as I understand, and maybe you have some thoughts on why they had that as a rule as well. I think one was not to be comparing each other's illness, because there were patients in so many stages of the disease at the sanatorium. And then it was also so that that wasn't, what you were talking about all the time. You tried to talk about something else, tried to define yourself as something other than a patient, so to speak.
I think so. I think when we go back, like I mentioned in my talk, I often think about, we talk about roles a lot, that we define our occupations by our roles, by who we are. And so there was probably, I don't know if they would have been able to articulate it as such, but there's something to be said for remembering that you're someone outside of this illness. That remembering that there are other things than just fighting this illness. There were other aspects to you. So let's, make sure you're sharing that with people.
They were, I think, much more forward thinking than they would have given themselves credit at the time at the sanatorium. One other question I had, what do you see as the sort of pros and cons of using occupational therapy in the way that they did for some of the patients as a means of income? Do you see that as a good thing because it maybe took some financial stress off of the patients, or as more of a con because it, redirected the value of the work they were doing into this sort of financial direction that maybe put pressure on the work that they were doing?
I guess that could go a little bit either way. From a overall mental health aspect, I would think that relieving some of the financial pressures would also just be helpful as well to, again, like you said, they probably weren't saying, they weren't saying mental health. They weren't looking at that. That wasn't the language of the time. But certainly giving individuals something to do, nobody's complaining that they're bored anymore. But also knowing that, and I also have this way to earn a little bit of money, I would think would be a benefit to a lot of patients, particularly knowing that there were patients who had to leave when they could no longer pay for that. I would think that that would have been a benefit for that. I think it was pretty forward thinking of them to look at how they could sell these items, and that they would send these catalogs out and the items were sanitized. And certainly that was a forward thinking piece as well, saying to people, these people still have, value and meaning and can do things that contribute.
Thank you. Well, I do want to bring it back to today, which you already did, because we've been talking so much about similarities between experiences with tuberculosis and with COVID-19 at the museum. And, I didn't even, I think, realize until I sat down to listen to you this time how much we all kind of had to step up and be our own occupational therapists a little bit during the lockdown, and how many people explored new crafts and new hobbies, or, found the time to go back to hobbies that they'd kind of let fall to the side because they were busy with their jobs and things like that. So hopefully we all hold on to that a little bit, because it certainly, I think, helped a lot of people get through the lockdown during the deep set part of the pandemic.
I hope so. I hope people have rediscovered things or discovered new things that, bring them that joy and that meaningful engagement. And I've been kind of casually observing throughout the pandemic the leisure interest items that have become hard to purchase because so many people decided to buy bikes and start bicycling again, that it was hard to find bikes, right? But I think what a great leisure activity that people are rediscovering. to some extent, as well as, like you said, so many other crafts, pulling things out people hadn't done in years. And hopefully maybe we found maybe we're trying to find a little more occupational balance again, not neglecting those leisure activities quite as much as maybe we did before.
Yes, indeed. One question to sort of, a couple questions to wrap up, I suppose. I know you do some work with pediatrics, and we don't talk a lot about we know a few stories of some younger patients who came to Saranac Lake, but we don't have many stories about children up here. So we don't hear a lot about the activities that children were doing to keep busy. We have a few notes about children whose parents maybe were sick and had to stay with someone in town. And I think we have a few sort of scribbles and doodles from kids and things like that. But could you maybe talk to that point a little bit? How this might look differently for patients who were younger or who were children.
So I don't have a lot of background in kind of the history of the pediatric piece. I know that looking through the archives, the Rehabilitation Guild, so that would have been later in this time, talks about working with local patients who had things like cerebral palsy or other conditions that may have been that would have been diagnosed in childhood, and they may have been working with kids more. Certainly, as a modern OT, when I'm working with a child, I'm thinking about the fact that work isn't a primary occupation for them, but certainly being a student might be. So how can I support them to be a student? And that looks different in kindergarten than it does in 6th grade, right? When we're working on cutting and coloring versus we're working on trying to keep a locker organized so you can find all your materials and get to class with what you need. That looks very different. And certainly we try as OTs to really consider how important play is as an occupation to children. And I can't emphasize enough the role that play plays for young children in their development and in their learning, and how much they learn both about the world and about social interaction and about how they communicate and how the world works through play. And so we probably didn't have a great understanding of that for a long, long time, because we know that how we view childhood now is very different from how people would have viewed it 150 years ago, but that there's a lot of value to play and learning, and I should say active play, that kids are engaged in.
Thank you. And one last question, which I hope is not unfair, but I'm only asking it because I know you love all of the historic photos from the archives of occupational therapy. If you were working as an OT back in the days of the sanatorium, what activities would you try out with the patients?
So I will say that when I was in OT school, and still now, I loved weaving. And I often tell my students I cannot knit or crochet, because if you put those tools in my hands, somehow I'm hopeless with the yarn, but I do sew. And so just the idea of doing the weaving and using those big, gorgeous floor looms. That's an occupation that I hope one of these days I can try out again. I've tried it before, and I love doing that. And I think I love the useful items it produces at the end. I think there's a lot of value to, those things, like for me, to things like weaving and pottery, where at the end you hopefully have this nice, like, usable thing. You have a decoration for your table, or you have a bowl you can use, or if you're sewing, you have a quilt that you can be cozy under. So I think those would have been my favorites.
I remember you mentioning the weaving, actually, when we were at the sanatorium now, and we do have some wonderful photos of the big weaving looms in the workshop as well. So no, I love that, having a strong meaning behind something that otherwise would be mundane.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's, I don't, it's one that appeals to me at least, but I think because you have something at the end that you've made and that you can use.
Right. Well, I think on that note, we can wrap up this recording for today. Thank you so much for both speaking at the sanatorium and with re-recording the talk with me today so that we can share it with more folks. Occupational therapy is such a big part of the history of the tuberculosis history that we tell here at the museum. So we really appreciate all of your knowledge and expertise and insight. So thank you so much for sharing that with us, and we can wrap up.
Sounds good. Thank you again. It was fun to record this and know that hopefully more people see it. So.
And I enjoyed getting to ask some of my questions as well. So thank you very much.
Absolutely.